In the late 1970s, a small group of explorers set out to achieve something that many experts considered impossible. Their goal was not simply to travel around the world. People had already circumnavigated the globe by ship, aircraft, and even by foot. The challenge facing these explorers was far more ambitious. They intended to complete the first surface circumnavigation of the Earth through both the North Pole and the South Pole. The explorers themselves would travel across the globe using only surface transport, although aircraft would occasionally assist with logistical support. Every mile had to be travelled on the surface of the planet. The expedition became known as the Transglobe Expedition, and it lasted nearly 3 years. It crossed oceans, deserts, ice caps, and some of the most dangerous environments on Earth. And when it finally ended in 1982, it had rewritten the history of exploration. This is the story of the Transglobe Expedition. Welcome to History Unpacked. If you enjoy the content, consider subscribing. We post every week and we welcome any feedback. The driving force behind the expedition was British explorer Ranulph Fiennes. Born in 1944, Fiennes had served in the British Army and developed a reputation for determination and endurance. He had already participated in a number of challenging expeditions and was constantly searching for a new objective that way he could push the limits of exploration. The idea for the Transglobe Expedition emerged during the early 1970s. At first glance, the concept seemed simple. The team would travel around the world while passing through both poles. Yet no one had ever accomplished such a journey. And the reason was obvious. The Arctic and the Antarctic represented some of the most hostile environments on Earth. Temperatures could fall far below minus 40 degrees Celsius. Sea ice shifted unpredictably, and equipment failures could quickly become life-threatening. Even reaching one pole was a major achievement. Crossing both as part of a continuous circumnavigation seemed almost impossible. Many sponsors were skeptical. Some experts believed the expedition would fail, others doubted it would even begin. Yet Fiennes remained determined. To help lead the project, he partnered with fellow explorer Charles Burton. Burton had served in the British Army and possessed extensive survival and navigational skills. Another key figure was Ginny Fiennes, whose work securing sponsorship, coordinating logistics, and managing communications would prove essential to the expedition's success. Together, the team spent years planning the journey. The preparation proved almost as difficult as the expedition itself. Funding had to be secured, vehicles had to be modified, supplies needed to be positioned in remote locations across the globe. The team also required a support vessel capable of operating in polar waters. The route would follow the Greenwich meridian as closely as practical, linking the North Pole and the South Pole in a continuous surface circumnavigation. Eventually, after years of preparation, the expedition was ready to begin. The Transglobe Expedition officially began on September 2nd, 1979. The starting point was the time of Greenwich in London. The location was symbolic. Greenwich sits in the prime meridian, the line used to measure longitude around the world. From there, the team headed south. Their support vessel was called the Benjamin Bowring. This ship would play a critical role throughout the journey, transporting supplies and assisting with logistics. The first major stage involved traveling through Europe and Africa. The expedition crossed France before moving into North Africa. From there, the team entered the Sahara Desert. Many people associate polar exploration with freezing temperatures. However, the expedition required survival in the opposite extreme as well. Temperatures in part of the Sahara exceeded 45 degrees Celsius. Vehicles struggled with the sand and the heat. Mechanical failures became a constant concern. The explorers often found themselves hundreds of kilometers from assistance. Despite the difficulties, they continued southward. Eventually, they reached southern Africa. This marked only the beginning of their journey. The truly dangerous sections lay ahead. After reaching South Africa, the expedition prepared for Antarctica. This would become one of the most significant phases of the entire project. At the time, relatively few people had crossed Antarctica overland. Even fewer had attempted lengthy journeys through the continent's interior. In 1980, Fiennes, Burton, and Oliver Shepard began their Antarctic crossing. Shepard would play an important role during this phase of the expedition and reached the South Pole alongside the others before later leaving the project for family reasons. The conditions were brutal. Temperatures regularly plunged below minus 50 degrees Celsius. Winds could exceed 160 kilometers per hour. Visibility often disappeared completely during blizzards. The men traveled using snowmobiles and sledges loaded with supplies. Mechanical problems became a constant threat. A broken engine in Antarctica was not simply inconvenient, it could prove fatal. The landscape itself seemed endless. Thousands of kilometers of ice stretched in every direction. Landmarks were non-existent. Navigation required constant precision. One small error could send an explorer far off course. This crossing lasted several months. During that time, the team endured isolation unlike almost anything experienced elsewhere on Earth. There were no towns, no roads, no rescue services, only ice, snow, and extreme cold. Eventually, after traveling across the Antarctic continent, the expedition reached the South Pole. For most explorers, reaching the pole would have represented the culmination of a lifetime achievement. For the Transglobe Expedition, it was merely one stage of a much larger journey. The team continued onward until they reached the opposite side of Antarctica. They had successfully completed one of the longest overland crossings in polar history. Following Antarctica, the expedition entered its next phase. The explorers traveled northward through the Pacific region before preparing for their Arctic assault. If Antarctica had been difficult, the Arctic presented an entirely different set of challenges. Unlike Antarctica's massive land-based ice sheet, the Arctic Ocean consists largely of floating sea ice. That ice constantly moves. Strong currents can push explorers backward even while they are traveling forward. Cracks can suddenly open beneath sledges. Areas that appear solid may collapse into freezing water. Planning an Arctic route is therefore extraordinarily difficult. In 1981, Fiennes and Burton began their attempt to reach the North Pole. Again, temperatures fell far below freezing. Again, equipment failures threatened progress. Yet this time, the moving ice created additional dangers. Some days the explorers advanced many kilometers only to discover that drifting ice had carried them backward overnight. Progress became frustratingly slow. At times they encountered pressure bridges where huge slabs of ice had collided and piled up into frozen walls. Crossing these obstacles required exhausting physical effort. The Arctic also presented a psychological challenge. Unlike Antarctica, where mountains and terrain occasionally break the monotony, the Arctic often appears as an endless white plain. Day after day, the explorers saw little change in their surroundings. Maintaining motivation became as important as maintaining equipment. Yet the expedition continued. Eventually, the team reached the geographic North Pole. For the first time in history, an expedition traveling continuously on the Earth's surface had successfully passed through both poles as part of a global circumnavigation. The achievement represented a milestone in the history of exploration, but there was still one final task. They still had to return to their starting point. After departing the Arctic, the expedition traveled south through North America and across the Atlantic. By this stage, nearly 3 years had passed since leaving London. The explorers had covered tens of thousands of kilometers. They had crossed deserts, oceans, glaciers, and polar ice. They had endured extreme heat and extreme cold. They had overcome financial difficulties, logistical problems, mechanical breakdowns, and countless environmental hazards. Finally, on August 29, 1982, the expedition returned to Greenwich. The circumnavigation was complete. The team had travelled approximately 35,000 miles, or around 56,000 kilometers. Most importantly, they had achieved something no one had ever accomplished before: the first surface navigation of the globe through both the North Pole and the South Pole. The success of the expedition attracted international attention. Many observers regarded it as one of the greatest exploration achievements of the 20th century. The scale of the journey was extraordinary. Unlike earlier polar expeditions focused on reaching a single destination, the Transglobe Expedition combined multiple major objectives into one continuous journey. It required expertise in desert travel, ocean navigation, polar survival, logistics, engineering, and leadership. The achievement also highlighted the importance of teamwork. Although Fiennes often became the public face of the expedition, success depended on a much larger group. Navigators, mechanics, sailors, support personnel, sponsors, and countless others contributed to the project's completion. Without their efforts, the expedition would likely have failed. The expedition also demonstrated how exploration was changing during the late 20th century. The great age of discovering unknown continents had long since ended. Instead, modern explorers sought new challenges through endurance, innovation, and the pursuit of seemingly impossible objectives. The Transglobe Expedition embodied that spirit. It showed that significant exploration was still possible, even in a world that had already been mapped.